This is a revision video on Louis MacNeice's poem Sunlight on the Garden. He was an Irish poet who was known as Freddie until his teens, with his real name is Frederick Louis MacNeice. But he adopted his middle name when he was a teenager. He was born in Belfast, and he was the son of a Protestant minister and a schoolmistress. When he was 6, his mother was admitted to a nursing home in Dublin. She was suffering from severe depression, and he didn't see her again. She survived uterine cancer, but she died of tuberculosis in December of 1914. His brother William had Down syndrome, and he was sent to live in an institution in Scotland during his mother's terminal illness. This caused some tension when he later married his wife, as her family were convinced that the Down syndrome would be passed on to any children that they might have. Louis was schooled in Sherborne and in Dorset, and then went to Marlborough College and Oxford University, where he first met W.H. Auden, who's another famous poet who is a contemporary of Louis MacNeice. He also met some other famous poets of the time, the 1930s poets, Stephen Spender and Cecil Day Lewis, and they collectively became known with Auden as well as McSpawn Day. So he moved to Birmingham and began lecturing classics. And for anyone that ends up going to Birmingham University, the arrow points to where Louis MacNeice's house was, and this is an area you'll come to know very well. And in a very self-centred way, the circle is where I used to live while I was doing my teacher training. Definitely not useful for your revision, but interesting personally for me when I was looking at the research for this. After marrying Mary Ezra, she left MacNeice for a Russian-American graduate student called Charles Katzman, who'd been staying with the family a few years later. They had a very, very young son together, Mary and Louis. In early 1941, MacNeice was employed by the BBC, and his work for the BBC initially involved writing and producing radio programmes, and they were intended to build support for the USA and later Russia. They were cultural programmes that emphasised the links between the countries rather than outright propaganda. He was awarded a CBE in the 1958 New Year's Honours List, and in August 1963, he went caving in Yorkshire to gather sound effects for his final radio play. He was caught in a storm on the moors, and he caught bronchitis, which developed into pneumonia. He died in hospital from the pneumonia, aged 55, and his final book of poems was published just a few days after his funeral. Louis MacNeice said of his poetry that poetry should be honest before anything else, and he refused to be objective or clear-cut at the cost of honesty. So he put a lot of emotion into his poems and a lot of real feeling. The sunlight on the garden hardens and grows cold. We cannot cage the minute within its nets of gold. When all is told, we cannot beg for pardon. So the sunlight seems to be fleeting and transient. It's only in a small section of his life. It's in his garden, and then suddenly it's gone and it's grown cold again. The juxtaposition of sunlight and grows cold creates a jarring effect, and it's possibly symbolic of death, and that kind of imagery pervades this poem. Grows slows the pace and creates an elongated tone, and this in addition with the harsh alliteration of C, so cold, cannot and cage, makes the poem seem very negative in its tone, very depressing. Cannot seems even more definite and final than can't, and the repetition in the third line and then in the sixth line again emphasises this sense of finality and being trapped and not able to do anything. Nets of gold and the sunlight itself could suggest that time is precious. You may be reminded in this poem of one of the poems that you might have studied at GCSE, Hour by Caroline Duffy, talking about the value of time and how you can't pin it down. There's also a reference to religion in terms of wanting to be pardoned for something, but not being able to. And there's imagery in this stanza, as well as the following stanzas, of being trapped. We're helpless to. Our freedom as freelancers advances towards its end. The earth compels, upon it sonnets and birds descend, and soon, my friend, we shall have no time for dances. So the sunlight can be seen as a metaphor for freedom, or vice versa, freedom could be seen as a metaphor for sunlight. But at the same time, this juxtaposes military imagery of lances and advances. So lances were the big wooden sticks that soldiers would compete with and fight with, try and knock another person off when they were jousting, and advances suggests a kind of military presence marching steadily towards them. The soothing assonance of lances and advances, those really soft vowel sounds, could suggest that although death is inevitable, there's a certain acceptance of it as well. It could also refer to the sun piercing through the clouds. The full stop creates a sense of finality at the end of the stanza and links with the idea that death is inevitable. Well, you've also got this idea of it being a love poem and the idea of love and acceptance. Sonnets are love poems and dancing suggests courtship. This poem was written after the divorce or after the separation with his wife, so perhaps there's a kind of sadness that that sort of thing's gone. The direct address in the fifth line of this stanza, my friend, it's colloquial and equal. Death is affecting everybody. And throughout this stanza, imagery of freedom and death. So the idea of birds is often used as a symbol of freedom, but the fact that they're descending could suggest that the freedom is fleeting, like the sunlight, and it's about to go. The sky was good for flying, defying the church bells, and every evil iron, siren, and what it tells. The earth compels, we are dying, Egypt, dying. So that half rhyme then between the third and fourth line is very interesting. It looks like it should be perfect, but it's actually imperfect. It links to the idea of begging for pardon that we've seen in the first stanza. In addition, sirens can be seen as a warning signal, but they were also present in Greek myths. They were mythical women who would lead sailors astray to their death. A church bell is ambiguous whether it's marriage or funeral, or perhaps that's kind of the reason that he's put it in there to kind of symbolise the human experience and happiness and sadness summed up in one thing. He's the son of a priest, so is he really defying religion here where he says he's defying the church bells? It's interesting to think about. Iron could suggest the idea of being in a prison as well, linking back to that idea of being trapped and that idea of inevitability and not being able to escape. You've got the repetition of the earth compels, highlighting the fact that death is going to happen, it's inevitable. And he's lamenting the transience of time, the fact that time won't stand still and that it can't be controlled. The final line in this stanza, we are dying, Egypt dying, is a quote from Shakespeare's play Antony and Cleopatra, and is alluding to the scene where Antony is telling Cleopatra, who's referring to as Egypt, that he's dying. And that suggests that death again pervades history and is timeless and affects everybody. There's an interesting juxtaposition between defying and compelled in this stanza, because surely they kind of contradict each other, and again it contributes to the sense of inevitability, but they can't defy it. And not expecting pardon, hardened in heart anew, but glad to have sat under thunder and rain with you, and grateful too for sunlight on the garden. So you've got the pathetic fallacy of the thunder and the rain. It's very melancholic, it's very sad. And MacNeice was writing in a time of modernism, a time of change, a time where people weren't sure how to think, and philosophy and art and literature were changing. And so this kind of reflects some of the gloomier things that were happening at the time. Events in Spain, and also having survived World War One, and being present, and the tensions with Germany building again. You do forgive a sense of melancholy at this point. By saying that they're sat under, he's positioning man below nature, he's kind of exalting the virtues of nature. And the rain is purifying, it could wash away the sin. The poem ends then with a slight sense of hope compared to the kind of despair that's been shown in the last three stanzas. And it kind of suggests that you should be thankful for minor blessings. The rhyme scheme, this applies to each stanza, it's ABC, BBC, although the metre of each line is different. And it's quite gentle, it's quite colloquial, it lends itself to being read aloud. And there's a lot to be said for the sounds in this poem and the way that you can read it and pick up on a lot of more things out loud than you might do if you were reading it in your head visually. John Stallworthy believes it was written as a love poem to Mary Ezra after their separation, but he also believes that the poem, propelled by its insistent rhymes, seems to move in a circle that on closer inspection proves to be a spiral, its end revealing a knowledge and wisdom not present at its beginning. And that idea of the form being reflected is interesting because you've got coming back to the same idea at the end, but also you've got the reversal of garden and pardon kind of mirroring the rhymes in the first stanza as well.